So today we're going to be talking about S-turns. It's important to learn S-turns to learn how to control the airplane in wind conditions. Um, these will help you get a feel for how to correct for wind. So some of the content we're going to be going over is wind correction, coordination, um, selecting a suitable altitude, selecting a suitable reference line, the basics of the maneuver, and what to do prior to entry and once you are in the maneuver. Some equipment you can reference is the Airplane Flying Handbook and the ACS. We're going to be talking a little bit about some standards in the ACS today. So let's jump right into it. So the ACS says the entry altitude should be between 600 and 1000 AGL. So when choosing your altitude, I would normally choose about 800 AGL because if you choose 1000, you're going to be right. There's going to be no room for error. And if you choose 600, there's also going to be no room for error. So 800 gives you about 200 feet of leeway with that. Um, but the ACS standards are that once you choose that altitude, you keep plus or minus 100 feet. So keep in mind that this is AGL and not MSL. So if if the area that you're flying over is already 600 feet AGL, then you would just add that on and do about 1400 feet AGL. Okay, so then selecting a reference point. You want your reference point to be relatively straight. So this can be a road or a railway or a relatively straight river. It can be the edge of a field if it's really long and distinct. Um, a couple things to keep in mind when choosing this line is that it should be um, perpendicular to the wind. So this says a straight ground reference line or road that lies 90 degrees to the direction of the wind. Because you're going to want to enter this maneuver on the downwind, going perpendicular to your reference line. Now, the ACS does not specify that you have to go in on the downwind, but the Airplane Flying Handbook does recommend it because this will give us some continuity with how we would perform this maneuver. So yes, and another thing to keep in mind is that you want to have a suitable landing field somewhere in the vicinity of this reference point, since we are coming so close to the ground. If we were to have an engine failure, you would need someplace close by to do an emergency landing. So to get the wind, you can use preferably a METAR, but you can also use smoke, water, the winds of like a soybean field. If you don't have access to a METAR or a weather service at a nearby airfield, the most preferable would probably be smoke. You can see in this picture here that the smoke is pretty clearly going to the right. I'm not sure what that direction is in this picture, but that should be a fairly easy way to see which direction the wind is going if you don't have access to a weather service. All right. Okay, so the basics of this maneuver. The maneuver consists of crossing the road at a 90-degree angle and directly beginning a series of 180-degree turns of uniform radius in opposite directions. Recrossing that road at a 90-degree angle as each 180-degree turn is completed. All right, so to accomplish the constant radius ground track requires changing the roll and rate and angle of bank. Both will increase or decrease as ground speed increases or decreases. So on the downwind side, the bank is going to be the steepest and gradually shallows. And then once you're on the upwind, once you cross your reference line again, the bank is going to be initially shallow and will gradually steepen as you turn. As with all ground reference maneuver, attention must be divided between the ground track and the airplane. Watch the reference line, maintain the ground track, make sure you fly the plane, so make sure you're looking at your altimeter and your slip skid coordinator. You want to make sure the plane is coordinated at all times. And you also want to be scanning for all, other traffic at all times because you're VFR, so you're responsible for maintaining separation of other aircraft. All right, so the maneuver. So prior to entry, just like all maneuvers, we'll do some clearing turns. So you can do two 90-degree turns or a 180 and just scan for traffic. Make sure to do these at a 30-degree bank so that other traffic will be able to see you with your wing raised. And then you also want to slow your airspeed to around 90 knots. This is usually a good airspeed because if you're going too much faster than this, you're gonna have to do the maneuver a lot faster. Okay, so the maneuver entry. The road or line should be approached on the downwind, so perpendicular to the line. When directly over the line, the first turn should be started immediately to the left. This says to the left. It can be started to the left or right. I'll go ahead and change that. But the first turn should be started immediately because you do have a tailwind, so your ground speed is going to be high. And if you don't start the turn immediately, your radius is going to be abnormally large. And we want it to be a just pretty neutral radius. Okay. So the roll needs to be rapid and the bank fairly steep. So the bank can be 40, 45 degrees. You don't want to go past 45 degrees, just so that we can maintain our airspeed because the regulations do say that you need to stay within 10 knots of your original specified airspeed. So that's another thing that I forgot to mention. But prior to starting the maneuver, you want to set that altitude. You also want to set your airspeed and you want to state that. So 1400 AGL, 90 knots, that's what you're sticking to. I would bug that on your G1000 or your altimeter and focus on keeping that constant. So yes, that's why you don't want to go too far past 45 degrees is because you want to maintain your airspeed. And when you're in a bank like that, you're losing a lot of your vertical lift because you're trading it for horizontal lift. And so that will cause you to sink, which will cause you to pitch up and lose some airspeed. Okay. So yeah, in this picture we have here, these 90 knots, 100 knots, 110 knots, that's your ground speed. So if you're planning on being at 90 knots, but you've got a huge tailwind, your ground speed might be 110 knots while your airspeed is 90. So because of this, you want to start that turn pretty rapidly as soon as you cross over your reference line. But then once you get to 90 degrees into the turn, so where my mouse is right here, that's when you want to start shallowing the bank because now you're coming onto a headwind and your ground speed is going to be a lot slower, so you want to shallow the bank. And I have a picture here that shows that pretty well. So you got the really steep turn here, and then you start shallowing it out here. And then once you cross your reference line, you're gonna start with a shallow bank. And if there's a really strong winds, you can even wait a couple seconds before starting that turn. So that you can have the same radius as the first turn. So start with a shallow bank, but then you're going to get a tailwind. So you're going to start a steeper bank, and then you should roll wings level as you cross the reference point again. All right, looks like I covered everything. All right. Yeah, so the first semicircle establishes the radius. So on the second semicircle, you're working to get the same radius as the first semicircle. All right. So constant added altitude, make sure you're cross-referencing your instruments. You should be looking outside the plane for the majority of this maneuver, but you want to make sure that you're also referencing your instruments to make sure that you're at the correct altitude and airspeed. So you should be looking outside of the plane and then every once in a while glance inside at your altimeter and your vertical speed indicator. All right. So, if you're struggling with this remover, one thing that I recommend is to um choose some visual reference points prior to entering the maneuver. So right here, that you can look for when you're at your furthest point of your radius. So in this one, for example, you go into your maneuver and then you know that you're going to be at your furthest point when we get to this tree line. And then you turn in, you cross your reference line, and then you look for this lake to make your turn back to your reference line. And your radius should be between 1/4 and a half a mile. It can usually be a little bit easier if it's a larger radius, but you don't want it to be excessively large. So choosing these points before entering the maneuver, maybe as you're descending down to your reference line, that can help you just double check that you are maintaining that radius with the first and second semicircle. All right, and then you also want to make sure you're coordinated. Don't use your rudder to turn the plane. Just make sure that ball is in the middle throughout the entire maneuver. A lot of times if you're looking outside the plane, you might start turning with your rudders. Make sure that you're also referencing that instrument as you do this maneuver. All right, so the ACS states to determine that the applicant can enter perpendicular to the selective reference line 600 to 1,000 feet AGL at an appropriate distance from selected reference area, and then maintain altitude plus or minus 100 feet and maintain airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. All right, so that is S turns.